Page 134. 134. Tis the grandest theme through the ages long. Tis the grandest theme for a mortal song. Tis the grandest theme that the world ever saw. Our God is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. Though by sin or rest, go to him for rest. Our God is able to deliver thee. 'Tis the grandest theme in the earth ornament. 'Tis the grandest theme for a mortal strain. 'Tis the grandest theme, tell the world again. Our God is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. Though by sin or rest, go to him for rest. Our God is able to deliver thee. 'Tis the grandest theme that the tidings roll to the guilty heart, to the sinful soul. But to God in faith he will make thee whole. Our God is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. Though by sin or rest, go to him for rest. Our God is able to deliver thee. 204. When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, while the saints of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. On that bright and cloudless morning, when the dead in Christ shall rise, and the glory of his resurrection share, when his chosen ones shall gather to their home beyond the sky, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. Let's all stand and sing the last verse. Let us labor for the Master from the dawn till setting sun. Let us talk of all his wondrous love and care. And when all of life is over and our work on earth is done, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. Good afternoon. Welcome back. Everybody's wide awake, right, and ready to go. Toughest crowd to preach to is afternoon Baptists. I do want to take the time to thank the church once again for inviting us out. It's good to be here. Like I said, a lot of memories.
I forgot this morning to thank the church, though, for the flowers, for my mom's passing, which was late last year, and then more recently, Susan's father. So thank you for that. Both my mom and her dad were very familiar with the church here, so it was very, very nice to get that kind gesture. And you probably heard, but my mom was not baptized, but she was in the hospital for a long time. I think, was it over a year? I forget how long, but we had a lot of talks. Probably the closest talks we've ever had spiritually. And I am as convinced as I think as I can be that she did have a testimony of salvation. And she did tell me she was planning on going home, that when she does get home, she wants to start coming to the Downey Church with us, and she wanted to get baptized, but it never got to that point. But then Susan's parents, a few years ago, both of them were saved and baptized in their late 80s. And that was a real blessing to be able to baptize both my mother-in-law and my father-in-law. I think I have a video of Susan's mom getting baptized, and Easton actually had to carry her into the baptistry at Downey. If you've never seen it, it's not quite like this. It's completely different. It's actually in the ground on the podium, on the stage, and I actually get down on one side of the baptistry where I stay dry, and the candidate actually sits down, and I lay them back and dunk them into the water. But she could not get into the pool herself, and Easton had to carry her in. But it was an amazing thing just to see them both. But again, thank you for the kind gesture in sending flowers. I'm going to ask you this afternoon to turn with me to Matthew chapter 13. I just want to consider a few things about this passage at the end of this chapter, which actually is the chapter that introduces Jesus' parable teaching ministry, which is prophesied of the Messiah. In fact, it was a very common way of teaching back in ancient times, using stories, similes, to kind of paint a picture with familiar, natural things, but then obviously make a higher, more spiritual application. So he does that in the first part of this chapter, which we're not going to consider so much. I want to consider what it says at the end of this chapter, though. And after he does start with the parable teaching, we're going to start in verse 53. So Matthew chapter 13 and verse 53, we read this, "And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these parables, that he departed. When he was come into his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, insomuch as they were astonished, and said, Where hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works?" Again, we talked about the astonishing aspects of the Messiah this morning. And then they say, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers, James, Joseph, and Simon, and Judas, 4 brothers, and his sisters, which aren't named? Are they not all with us? Where then has this man these things?" And they were offended in him. But Jesus said unto them, "A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and house." And he did many mighty works there because of their unbelief. So the scenario is that Jesus is back in a very familiar place, a place where he grew up. And they're astonished at the teaching because they remember him as little Jesus. You know, they grew up with him before he was manifested as the Messiah, which wasn't until he was 30 years old. So in this little community, they were all familiar with him. He had many relatives there, and they just thought of him as one of them. They didn't really start thinking about, all of the eternal things associated with him at that point. I wonder how much the rumors of his birth were going around, or if that just kind of died out after a while and became just like a common thing or a common thought, maybe not thought of as real. But now that he starts his ministry, things get, as I mentioned this morning, elevated to another level. And it's not so much the works that he's doing, the healings and that sort of thing. It's really his teachings that were the astonishing thing. And all they're doing is making a natural association. They're seeing him teach these things. They're wondering where he got this knowledge from because he was one of them. And they ask the question, is this not the carpenter's son? So, title of the message this afternoon is The Carpenter's Son. Now, when I think of a carpenter, my mind naturally thinks of somebody who works with wood, cabinetry or furniture, that sort of thing, maybe even building homes out of wood. But the word used for carpenter, that's translated from carpenter, is the Greek word tekton, which really means a builder, somebody who uses natural elements to build, largely with wood, but it can also mean using stone or even metalwork. I had forgotten when metal began to be something that people worked with, but it's actually quite ancient. It goes back many, many centuries before this point. So there was a lot of ways of building things that you really had to use your hands and manipulate either wood or stone or metal to form it into what you wanted it to be, to make something useful or maybe even livable. But this was his craft. This was Joseph's craft. And very typically it was the craft or the career of the family. And Jesus being the oldest son of Mary and Joseph, although again, he had no physical relationship to Joseph, which is interesting to think about. I guess Joseph just kind of took him on as a stepchild, so to speak. But he was raised. If this was a little bit more modern times, I think the surname of this family would have been Carpenter, the Carpenters. Oftentimes a craft or a career, they would take on that kind of name. But they didn't have that at this time, but he was known as the carpenter's son. I'm going to talk about Peter in a little bit, but before he became Peter, he was known as Simon Bar-Jonah. Simon, son of Jonah. Jonah was his father. So here we see where they recognize Jesus purely in a physical way of being the carpenter's son, Joseph's son. They really weren't making a spiritual application. So this passage got me thinking, was Jesus really a woodworker? A lot of the movies that we see, if you watch movies about the life of Christ, you might see him working with wood, maybe making tables and chairs. I think I saw one where he was making a table and a chair, but I don't think they used tables and chairs, at least not in this culture at this time. That came along much later. These we might call Oriental, Eastern type of cultures, they mainly sat on the floor with a very low table to eat at. So maybe he did make the table. Another thing is, did he build homes? Is that what his job was, working with wood to build homes? This is how my mind kind of pictures him. But as you think about the usage of this word more, tekton, which is translated carpenter, it might open up another dimension of maybe thinking more about what it actually was that Joseph and Jesus were involved in. One of the terms that this can be translated as is not just a woodworker, carpenter, but it could be a stonemason. It was very common back at this time. A lot of buildings were made of stone. And of course, when you use stones, you have to get the rocks, usually out of a quarry, and then you have to fit it to be part of whatever framework you're doing. You can't just take, rocks and build a house with it. You have to cut it, you have to manipulate it, you have to make it fit into this building. Now, doesn't this sound familiar on a spiritual level? It should. I'll explain more what I mean by that, maybe by going to a passage over in Matthew chapter 16. Now, I'll say this. I don't know exactly what the Bible means by a carpenter. It's kind of vague for us, but I'll tell you what, though, I think this fits a little bit more than Jesus being a woodworker type of a carpenter. So in Matthew chapter 16, we see this, a very familiar passage, one that has become a favorite of mine in recent years for several reasons. It always has been, but its depth is amazing. Simple verse in verse 18 of Matthew 16 says, I say also unto thee, he's talking to Simon Bar-Jonah. He says that you are Peter. I don't know if this is the first time recorded he uses this reference to Simon. We know him usually as Peter, but he says that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And I have to touch on this just briefly. And he says about this church, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I've mentioned this at Downey several times as we've been looking at this over the years, but that's a very comforting thought on the one hand, because we know that whatever the church goes through for the next 2,000 years, that it's going to survive. But on the other hand, he's telling us very specifically that the gates of hell are going to try to prevail. And in some respects, in many respects actually, the gates of hell have prevailed against many of the Lord's churches. Not institutionally, the church is still here. I believe that as much as I believe anything. That institutionally, the church that Jesus started is still here. And I believe that we are part of those churches. I believe that with all my heart. That we have a history that goes back through time, that goes back to the days of Jesus. I hope you believe that as well. That's essential to believe. But make no mistake about it, the gates of hell had prevailed over many of our past forefathers. Not just physically. I don't even think really physically has a lot to do with it, with the torture and things that our forefathers went through. I mean doctrinally, how many of our forefathers in scriptural churches have given themselves over to false doctrine and following after lies and things like that and departing the faith. I think that's how Satan gets his victory over the Lord's churches. But back to this point. He says unto Simon, he says that you are Peter, and you probably know this. You've heard this many times if you've been around the Lord's work, that he's kind of using a play on words here with Simon. He says, you are Peter. The word Peter is actually better translated a rock. It's the word Petros, okay? It's a common Greek name even today. But it means a rock. It means a smaller rock that you would use to build a house that would, or a rock that would need to be chiseled and worked on, manipulated in order to fit into a particular building, in order to find its place in that building. So he's taken this, what he's saying here, to another level with regards to Simon. He says, you are Peter. But then he does it again, where he says that upon this rock. Now, English language messes things up a little bit because it's just bad on many levels. But the word rock is also, it's a similar word to Petros, but it's Petra in the feminine sense. And it has more the idea of a foundation, something that you would build upon. Still a rock, but you build upon it. You really don't manipulate a foundation. You use it as a solid foundation to build something upon. So, and we know that's talking about him. In fact, I'll use the natural references for that in a little bit, with Jesus as the foundation. So when you think about this, the carpenter's son from this perspective, it makes sense to me, at least in this respect, that this word has more to do with using stones to build on a spiritual sense. Physically, I don't know what Jesus did. I mean, it's very vague as to, for the first 30 years of his life, after he was able to start working with Dad, exactly what he was doing. It jumps from the time he was 12 years old, it mentions him. Then the next thing we read about him is when he's 30 years old, he's getting baptized by John. So we don't really know a whole lot between that time. But I'll use my imagination, see if you agree with this or not. It makes sense to me that physically Jesus was, as a laborer, physically, he would be more of a stonemason rather than a wood carpenter. At least that's what I think. Using stones to build houses or synagogues or temples. I understand that in this area around this time, maybe not exactly during the time of Jesus, but in some of the areas of Galilee and Judea, they were actually doing a lot of building of houses and other marketplaces that were made of stone. So it was a career that was, I would imagine, very lucrative. You needed men that were strong, that could get the stones from the quarries, carry them however they got them from one place to another, and then manipulate them, okay, in order to fit whatever they were building. So the next passage I want to go to, and I'm not going to keep you very long this afternoon. I thought that would get a big amen. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 10, so we'll consider some things here. Now, this is Peter. He's now known as Peter. I don't know if he's called Simon much anymore, but he's called by the name that Jesus gave him. So starting in verse 1 of 1 Peter chapter 2, he says this, "Wherefore, laying aside all malice and guile and hypocrisies and envies and all evil speakings, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. If so be you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. To whom," speaking of the Lord, "coming as unto a living stone." Now this is a different word, stone, than the word rock. But it's still something that is used of the earth to build things with. And by the way, the word tectone, we get our English word tectonic plates from that word. And it's the big earth plates that they're parallel to one another, or whatever we might say, and sometimes they shift, which causes earthquakes. But it has to do with the earth. And this is where these rocks that Jesus mentioned comes from. The word stone is mentioned here, but it's used in a spiritual sense, a lively or a living stone. Naturally, stones don't live. I used to think when we moved out here to Rialto back in 2000, there are so many rocks around here. And I used to think that they multiplied. I didn't think it was possible until we moved here, but stones are inanimate. They don't reproduce. I probably have a hard time convincing some people who live here about that, but it seems like the more you dig out the rocks, the more that come. But anyway, they are inanimate objects. But Jesus takes us again to a spiritual level. He's talking about a spiritual stone, a spiritual rock. He says, "Disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious. You also," okay, so he's talking about Jesus there, the lively stone. But then here also he says, "You, as lively stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." So my imagination now goes to this. If we're going to use the natural sense of a stone quarry, then you have the stone laborers, the masons and so on, go out and gather the stones, get them out of these quarries, take them to wherever they're going to build, whatever they're building. You have to chisel the stones to make them fit properly. I kind of see that in a spiritual sense as God with us, choosing us out of a mass of dead stones. He chooses us. He calls us. He burdens us. He convicts us. And once we're convicted to the point of trusting in him, we become alive. I see us very much in our lost state as just a dead stone. There's not really much, you can do spiritually with it. But once we're made alive, there's a lot God can do. Now, think with me about this. Those of you that have testimonies of salvation, think back to the time that you were saved. Has not God molded you and manipulated you, cut some things off, maybe kind of make you to fit into his work? I don't think we naturally fit. He has to work with us to get us to fit. Again, just how my mind is thinking about this, but nonetheless, we are lively stones. Then he goes on to say in verse 6, again, speaking about Christ, "Wherefore also," it is contained in the scriptures, "Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believes on him shall not be confounded. Unto you, therefore, which believe, he is precious. But unto you which are disobedient, the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner," or the capstone of this. Now, my understanding is that the capstone is the one that goes on the top. I've heard different things about that, actually. That it is the one you put first and then you build around it. But the capstone is the one that completes it, finishes it. But nonetheless, the capstone is speaking about Christ. He is the head of the corner. In verse 8, it calls him a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. One of the things that occurred to me in thinking about it in this way is not only in this passage, and just using the word carpenter in this sense, is how many times this word stone is used with reference to us and being built by Christ. So I forgot my place. Verse 8, a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disallowed, whereunto you are also appointed. But you are rather, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That word peculiar. Now, I typically think of peculiar as something that's strange. And that may be true. I think to the world, we look kind of strange in the things that we do. But the word is actually precious. You are precious. You're valuable. You, as a child of God, a member of his church, are very valuable. You know, there's a lot of stones that naturally carry a lot of value to them. Diamonds, gold, other jewels, or other elements have a lot of value, usually because of their rarity. And I think that may have to do with why we are so valuable to the Lord. Number one, he purchased us. But number two, it's a rare commodity to find somebody who truly is dedicated to the Lord. And that's what Peter is trying to convince these scattered Jews, is to keep their faith in the one that chose them and that is now assembling them to be part of his people. It is a very precious thing to be part of this. In verse 10, which in time past you were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. And I think I saw really as far as I need to go with this. The next passage I want to go to is in 1 Corinthians. If you've been kind of thinking along the same lines that I'm dealing with this, your mind might have gone to this passage. And I think it's perfectly accurate as far as the context here. And I want to start, I'm going to start in verse 1, just to get the full context of what Paul is writing here to this church at Corinth. A lot of the first part of this chapter is very important. So we'll start in verse 1, and he says in verse 1, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he says, I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. That's a sad commentary to this church, this Corinthian church. If you read the whole letter that he writes, this church was a mess. They had a lot of problems. It was very carnal, a lot of sin in this church, but they were still the Lord's church nonetheless. But Paul tells them, I can't talk to you in a spiritual manner. I have to lower the level of my conversation to where you can understand it on a more carnal level. And it's sad when that has to be done for children of God. Children of God should be on a more spiritual level, should be making spiritual applications really in every aspect of our life. But in this case here, they're a carnal church. They are a carnal people. He refers to them as babes in Christ. He says in verse 2, I have fed you with milk and not with meat, for hereto you are not able to bear it, neither yet are you able, for you are yet carnal. And whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are you not carnal? And I've always found this phrase interesting, that he calls them. He says, you walk as men. The Lord's church, the Lord's people should not be walking as men. Our level of life should be on a higher level. I'm going to use this now, Brother Albert. I didn't use it this morning. So in verse 4 he says, for while one says, I am of Paul, and another says, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul and who is Apollos? But ministers, by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man. I planted, Paul says, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Sometimes we put way too much emphasis on men. Sometimes men like to make a name for themselves and lift themselves up. And sadly, maybe more unfortunate, is when people lift men up. Men don't need to be lifted up. It's not our efforts that do anything. Christ is the one that gets all the glory. He's the one that gets all the praise. If we're obedient and just doing our job, it doesn't matter. There's no competition going on here, especially within the ministry, we might say. So in verse 8 now he says, "Now he that plants and he that waters are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor." Again, we're not in competition with each other. We do what God has called us to do. My job within the context of the Lord's work is to do with my life what he has manipulated me to do. It is completely different than what he has, I'll say, called you to do. And he's working on you in one way or another for his glory, to make you fit in his plan. We don't naturally fit into the work of God. We have to be changed. And it starts initially spiritually, being born again. So then he says, again, where did I leave off? Verse 9, "For we are laborers together with God. You, the church, are God's husbandry. You are God's building." Again, we have the idea of a building, a structure. "According to the grace of God, which is given unto me as a wise master builder." Paul calls himself a wise master builder. Not in a boastful way. Really with Paul, when he says things like this, it's really truly a humble way. I don't think he thought himself worthy of doing the call that God called him to do. But when God did call him, he said, "You are a chosen vessel of mine to do what I'm leading you to do." But he says that he is a wise master builder. I keep losing my place. Verse 10, he says, continuing on, he says, "I have laid the foundation, another man builds thereupon, but let every man take heed on how he builds thereupon." Now, this is where really I want to connect it with Matthew chapter 13 and then also 1 Peter. He says, "For other foundation can no man lay than that which is Jesus Christ." Now, as with most of the scriptures, he's not just talking about being saved. He's talking about really the work of God with those that are already saved. So he's talking about the church here. "For other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds upon this foundation." So just think, we'll make this more personal than I think that it's really implying here. But just think about your own life and how you're building with what God has given you. What are you doing with the tools that God has given you? And what material are you building with? And this is the application that he's going to make. He says, first of all, again in verse 11, "For other foundation can no man lay than that which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds upon this foundation," then he gives 6 elements of building with. First of all, we have gold, silver, precious stones, metals that can be heated up, burned. They usually are, oftentimes to get the impurities out of them and to mold them, pound them into a shape that they want to use. But gold, silver, precious stones, then he says also wood, hay, and stubble. These elements are very, very temporal. And all of these elements really are temporal in one way or another, but if we're going to build something we want to endure and to last, we're going to choose something that is more along the lines of a metal or a stone rather than wood, hay, and stubble. We know what happens with wood, hay, and stubble. It lasts for a while, and then usually the elements such as weather, we'll get to it, termites, that sort of thing, it won't last all that long. Then he says in verse 13, "Every man's work shall be made manifest." And the way I see that is this. Personally, as members of the Lord's church, we're going to stand before God and we're going to give an account as to how we built with what the Lord has given us. What did we use? Every man's work will be made manifest for the day. I believe that to be the day of the Lord, the judgment day. Shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. The fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. There's several times in the scriptures where, especially in Revelation, when the Lord is seen, it says that his eyes are as a flame of fire, judgment. And that's what fire pictures. It pictures judgment. Our works are going to be tried of what sort of work we did. If any man's work, in verse 14, abides, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. So this isn't talking about salvation, because we know that salvation is not a reward. Salvation is a gift of God that he gives to us. That what we do with that gift afterwards is where all this comes in, the rewards that we get. So let's consider the elements again. If we're going to use gold, silver, precious stones as the tools or the things we build with in our life, those things endure. Those are the spiritual works. Those aren't the carnal works. The wood, hay, and stubble are the selfish works, the things that burn up in judgment. And I love how he goes on to describe this from this point. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as by fire. And I think just a very simple application of this is that in judgment, there will be, most likely, a lot of people. I have no idea how to put a ratio or a number on that, but there will be people who stand before the Lord, they're saved, but they have no spiritual works to show for it. Everything is burned up, but they're saved. They are saved. That's a glorious thing. But what the Bible presents to us is there is so much more that God has called us to, that he wants for us. Then he goes on to say, he mentioned the reward, he mentions the loss. He says in verse 16, he says, know you not that you are a temple of God? A temple of God. That you are, this church at Corinth is a temple of God. And that the Spirit of God dwells in you. I'll just give you just a simple way of how I see this. I see this as Paul talking to the church, telling them that they are a temple. It says the temple, but Corinth was not the only temple, the only church. There were many churches. Really, the correct rendering is that you are, as the Corinthian church, a temple. We could say it this way. This Rialto church, the Mount Vernon Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, is a temple of God. Not made up of this physical structure, but made up of its members. The stones that have been born again, that have been added to the church through baptism, that are dedicating their life to these spiritual causes. That is this building. That is this church. And that is where the Spirit of God dwells, among you all. The same thing can be said of Downey, or San Dimas, or Whittier, or any of our sister churches that we know of, thousands upon thousands that we don't know of. The same thing is true with each individual church. They are a temple of God. So the application that I've made here is with Jesus being a carpenter, as I think you've seen in this presentation, is more along the lines of using stones rather than wood. At least that's kind of how I see it here. So we are, as the Lord's people, a temple of God. We are a place where spiritual sacrifices are made. I'll use this passage in closing, going back to 1 Peter chapter 2. I wasn't quite sure where to use this first, before 1 Corinthians, or afterwards. So I guess I'm going to use it both. I've already read these verses in chapter 2 of 1 Peter, but in verse 9 he says about these saints he's writing to, that you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And that's who we are. He called us. He chose us out of the darkness of this world. We responded in faith. He saved us. He washed us. Then we are baptized and we become part of his church, and this is where the light is. This is where the spiritual enlightenment is. It's not out there. I know that I think everybody goes through times in their life, every child of God does, thinking that there's something out there that we can benefit from. There's very little that is out in the world that will benefit us spiritually. Yeah, we have to live in the world, but the world is not our home. Really, we're just passing through, as as Abraham was. We're sojourners. We're passing through this world, trying to do the best we can to maintain what the Lord is doing through us. And as you all know, it's not easy. And I might add this, that I was thinking about this, as I said, I thought about a lot of things just before coming here. One of the things that I thought about is how, it's been 7 years, I think, since we left. There's been a lot of changes. A lot. Not just in the area here. It's like a different area in Rialto here. There's all these buildings and shopping centers that have gone up since we were here. But the world, it's from then in 2016 to now, it's like a different world. And I don't know if any of you think about it in this way. I don't know how you probably have thought about it. I don't know how much stock you put. But doesn't it seem like we're that much closer to the coming of the Lord? I know we probably all thought about that. It could be within our lifetime or our children's lifetime. But at this point, I'm fully convinced that it's going to be soon. That being said, it's time for God's people to really kind of step it up a couple of notches and not just buckle down to hold on and maintain, but really to actively be a presence of light in this fallen world, because it's going to continue to get darker. Satan is going to continue to do more and more. I'm amazed at some of the things that are going on in the news, which is why I try not to watch the news all that often, because I scratch my head and think, how can you justify the things that are being passed across as good? It doesn't make any sense. It's like we're aliens on this planet. And I think we are. Anyway, that's all I've got this afternoon. I don't know if we want to stand and have a song of invitation. Brother Albert, I'll turn it over to you and let you close out the service. Let's all stand and maybe sing a song and then close out in prayer. Or whatever you decide.